Good morning, this is Daniel here with Cops and Cons TV. Just want to welcome everyone into our live stream. So if you could let us know in the comments here where everybody's from, maybe we'll have a local story or some information about where you're coming from today. So part of what we do here on this live stream every Friday is I go over some of the most important and interesting stories that happen in the world of police and law and news, and all of these issues are connected, and a lot of them are a lot of issues even in news and in law they have to do with policing, and policing is just one of the most interesting things that are out there and one of the most important topics that we can be talking about. So kind of like we do every time as I'm going through these stories, it'd be great if you could just put in comments and questions if you have anything for us. If you have some information that maybe I don't have here, or you have a different take on it, definitely put it in the comments and we can go ahead and go back and forth a little bit. I'm always interested to see what our audience has to say about these cases. And so just if you haven't already, make sure you go ahead and subscribe to Cops and Cons TV. That way you know when we do our live stream. So we usually do it sometime around lunchtime on Fridays, but definitely subscribe to our channel so you can know exactly when we're going to be coming on live. Also, if you want to follow me, go ahead and do that at Police Law News on TikTok and YouTube and all other channels. And the first thing that I want to start with today is to, first of all, I want to thank everyone for participating in our 14-hour live feed that we had on by accident. So there were some really funny and interesting comments. Not sure how that got turned on, but the 14-hour live stream did really good. Definitely going to bump up our numbers. So thank you so much for participating in that. Also, I want to give a shout out to Captain McCoy over at the Fulshear, Texas Police Department. Every now and then, police departments and supporters of law enforcement send us patches, which is how we have this awesome patch wall behind us. So I just want to give a shout out to Captain McCoy over at the Fulshear Police Department in Texas. They send us a patch. We think that is awesome. Anyone else who's in law enforcement who wants to do that, and we can definitely put it up on the wall behind us and feature it, send us an email and we will arrange that. But again, thank you so much to the Fulshear Police Department and Captain McCoy. That is, it's always awesome to get stuff like that. So let's see, where's everybody from today? We've got Sergeant George. I wish we had 10,000 like you. Let's see, we got someone from Kentucky. Great. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get into these stories. The first story that we have to get into, it really broke last night. As soon as I woke up this morning, this is the absolute first thing I saw. So didn't think I was going to be leading with this, but things happen sometimes that you can't do anything about. So in San Francisco, Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, he's 82 years old. He was the victim of a violent crime last night. And the San Francisco Police Department did a press conference a little bit ago, and here's what we know so far. So last night at approximately 2:30 in the morning, Nancy Pelosi, obviously she's the Speaker in the House. After the Vice President, she would be next in line to be President of the United States. She was in Washington, D.C., and her husband, 82-year-old Paul Pelosi, was home alone. While he was home at 2:30 in the morning, an assailant, a 42-year-old, broke into the house and essentially tried to kidnap and hold Mr. Pelosi hostage. This is a serious violent crime. The individual was armed with a hammer, and he actually did beat Mr. Pelosi with the hammer. He tried to tie him up. Some of the things that the offender said during this is he was saying, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" And he was saying that he wanted to basically try to hold and tie up Paul Pelosi until Nancy Pelosi came home. Now, the information that we have right now is that there weren't police on site. So police officers weren't physically there guarding the house, but there must have been some video feed or some surveillance or security system, because police officers responded and were actually able to get there really quickly. The information from both the San Francisco Police Department and the Capitol Police, who does have responsibility and jurisdiction along with the U.S. Marshals to provide security for people in Congress and elected officials. What they said is that as police got there on scene, that somehow both Mr. Pelosi and the offender, this 42-year-old man, were both armed with a hammer, or they were wrestling over the same hammer. And it was at that point that the police officers rushed in and tackled the offender. So they did give his name, which I'm not going to read on here. They did say he's a 42-year-old male, and they did not announce a motive. But if we think about this, the fact that he was yelling, thinking, where's Nancy? Where's Nancy? I mean, not that it is for sure, but just thinking the most reasonable thing to think is that this is someone who is ideologically opposed to Nancy Pelosi. The where's Nancy chants kind of is reminiscent of some of the nonsense that happened on January 6th. So I'm not saying that's for sure what happened, but that's what it seems like, at least from the limited information that we've been getting from law enforcement this morning. This isn't the first time that the Pelosi's home has been targeted by criminals. So back last year, there was some painting and some vandalism that was done at the Pelosi's home. In spray paint, the words "cancel rent" and "we want everything," along with a pig's head, were left on their property. So when you look at that evidence, that seems like, okay, that's someone from the far left, the whole cancel rent crowd, the "we want everything" crowd. That's typically stuff from the far left that you would see that from. However, this time it does seem like it's someone who is on the right side of things, far right, unreasonable and insane. Is what it seems like the individual today. So the good thing is that he was arrested by police. He is in custody. I'm sure they'll give us more information. And they did say that Mr. Pelosi is recovering. He should make a full recovery. But think about it. This guy is 82 years old. He's been through a lot with his drunk driving arrest. And then now with this, any 82-year-old who's beaten with a hammer, it just isn't a good situation. So, yeah, I think it's good that he's making a recovery, and hopefully they hold this violent offender responsible. The idea that there wasn't just immediate security there, I'm not really sure what the deal is with that, but maybe the Pelosi's will think about either protecting themselves with firearms or something else in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And it just because this happened in San Francisco, San Francisco is just one of the far left cities, and it's not that I'm trying to criticize the far left. It's that I'm trying to criticize and look at different policies, because a lot of the time bad public policy leads to predictable results. And I've always talked about cities like Seattle and Portland and Austin who kind of put forth these progressive policies that have, really just predictable, just bad results. And San Francisco is a prime example of that. But the difference in San Francisco is that, at least in the last year or so, the people there are kind of starting to fight back. So let's just rewind this just a little bit. And, one of the things that happened in San Francisco, so between 2018 and 2022, so within a 3.5-year period, Walgreens closed 23 stores in the San Francisco area. And this isn't because people stopped needing to get prescriptions. It's not because, the owners who own these Walgreens just, didn't want to make any more money, or the businesses, weren't profitable. The reason is because of crime. Because of crime and shoplifting was just so out of control, they couldn't keep merchandise on the shelves, and the Walgreens stores also couldn't keep their employees and customers safe. So, and this is, again, these things don't just happen randomly. There's a reason why this was happening in San Francisco and not happening in Tulsa, or not happening in other cities around the country. So when we have bad results like this, it's really important to say, okay, what policies were in place that led to this? And in California, in San Francisco, with what led to 23 Walgreens stores closing, it's really easy to look at. What you have to do is, back in 2020, Gavin Newsom, the governor, signed a bill into law in California that had to do with shoplifting. It essentially said that shoplifting, anything under $950, is considered a misdemeanor. Okay, so usually when it comes to shoplifting, just like in the state that I'm currently in, the level that would determine shoplifting from felony to misdemeanor is $500. So in my state, if you shoplift $498, it's going to be a misdemeanor. If you shoplift $501, it's going to be a felony. Okay, so and it's almost the level of felony and misdemeanor. So essentially, the level for a felony in my state is pretty low. It's twice as high. So you could think about, you would really have to steal a lot of shit from Walgreens to get over $950. So I guess where I'm going with this is, essentially almost every shoplifting offense in San Francisco was considered to be a misdemeanor. Okay, so we have the bad law that makes most shopliftings misdemeanors in California. Now we go to San Francisco specifically. Well, the San Francisco Police Department, in line with progressive theories on how to control the city and how to prevent crime and how to be a little more, I guess, pro-criminal they had a policy, the San Francisco Police Department, that any misdemeanor that the police officers, unless there were extenuating circumstances, they just weren't supposed to make arrests. They're supposed to issue tickets or summonses, or essentially, people don't show up to these summonses. So it's essentially, there's just, police officers, even if you were caught, you weren't going to go to jail. So essentially, now we have this California law that makes almost all shoplifting a misdemeanor, and then the specific policy for police officers in San Francisco that they really just can't take any enforcement action against most shopliftings, and that's how this happened. But like I said, San Francisco, as much as I've just criticized it, which is reasonable, it's only fair to say that they've kind of been fighting back. So the mayor, London Breed, back just about a year ago in December of 2021, she ran on, so she's very far left. Obviously, she's the mayor of San Francisco. She's not going to be a conservative. Very far left, and she actually ran and was elected on a platform of defund the police. Well, once she got in office, in less than a year in office, she realized all these things that I just said about crime being out of control, about all these Walgreens closing, and she saw that, this is not a net good for the people who actually live here, the regular, normal citizens who just want to be able to go to Walgreens, the senior citizens who live in San Francisco who want to be able to walk to the corner Walgreens store to get their prescription. Yeah, they should be able to do that. So London Breed, back in December of 21, she gave a speech, and it was really an impassioned speech where she basically walked back all of the defund the police nonsense that she had ran on. She said they weren't going to do that, that instead there was going to be the opposite. She said there was going to be a crime crackdown, and she said that the reign of terror that criminals are putting on the city and the regular citizens is going to come to an end. That's coming from the mayor of San Francisco about a year ago. Again, someone who ran on and was elected on a defund the police platform. So the result had to be so bad for essentially her to admit, hey, these policies were a mistake, we're going to change it. Now, it's absolutely fair for me to point out, and for all of us to point out the bad policies, but we should also acknowledge when politicians also acknowledge the policies are bad and are going to make a change. Also, what San Francisco did, and I can never say this guy's name, Chesa Boudouin, the progressive pro-criminal DA, he was up for a recall election this past June of 2022, and he was actually recalled and fired from his job by the residents of San Francisco. So all of these things, San Francisco, of the different cities who do have kind of, progressive policies that tend to lead to predictably lead to more crime. At least San Francisco seems like the voters are sick of it. It's one of those things. They always say that San Francisco is the most far left city. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think one of the reasons why we see this in San Francisco, the voters and the mayor kind of changing course, is because they pretty much hit rock bottom. So once you've hit rock bottom, you really don't have anywhere else to go. And this is something that Adam Carolla on his show says all the time, that why do we have to wait till we get to rock bottom? When we have record homicides in New York and Chicago and LA, and violent crime is out of control, and the crime rates are the highest they've been in decades, why can't we make a change now? Why do we have to wait till it hits rock bottom? But it seems like San Francisco did hit that rock bottom and are doing something about it, which is good. So let's see if we have any comments on that. Nick the Okie. Nick says Oklahoma is fantastic. I think I mentioned Tulsa. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. We've got Sandy Bagwell in San Antonio. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, so that's reasonable. Let's see. Red General District Court. What do you think of the new table method? Cops are adapting taser assist baton led enforcement. I don't know what that is. So maybe you can put a link to it in there and I can see after the show. I'm not sure exactly what that is. Okay, so so that's the Nancy Pelosi story. Obviously we all wish Paul Pelosi a quick recovery, and hopefully the criminal who did this, any violent criminal, no matter who the victim is, should do years in prison, and hopefully that is what happens here. I want to talk about a school shooting. So there was a school shooting last Monday on October 24th that happened in St. Louis. And unlike other school shootings, for some reason, this one just didn't get a whole lot of national media attention. So this was a 19-year-old individual who went into a school in St. Louis, and he was armed with a rifle, and he shot 9 people. He actually killed 2 people, a 15-year-old student and a 61-year-old teacher, and then 7 other people were injured. So there were 9 people that were shot. And, this story just didn't get that much national attention, and I'm really interested and curious in the comments is if maybe, people can put in there what their thoughts are and why they think that might be the case. So a little bit of information on this. So this 19-year-old individual, he did have some mental health problems. Police were called to his house multiple times for suicide attempts. They were also called because, and the most interesting thing about this is that 9 days before this happened, so on October, I believe it was October 15th, his family called police because they found this exact rifle, this exact gun. They found it in the house, and they didn't think that he was mentally competent enough to handle this gun, so they called the police. So the police got there, and it's one of those things where the police kind of agreed, but they really couldn't do a whole lot about it. So, if you're a 19-year-old and you're legally able to own a gun, if there's no other reason, you're not in the moment, you're not threatening to kill yourself or you're not threatening to harm anyone else, there really just isn't a lot police officers can do. So I know we've talked before about red flag laws, but Missouri doesn't have a red flag law. So even if police wanted to confiscate the gun, it just wouldn't have been legal for them to do. So what happened was police officers essentially gave the firearm to another member of the family who didn't live with this individual, and for them to hang on to the firearm. But that it's an illegal order. I mean, essentially, even if the police wanted to, they can't just take someone's firearm. It's just not something that they're able to legally do unless a crime's been committed, or some states have laws where if someone is actively in the moment threatening suicide or threatening to harm someone, that might be a reason. But just a family member saying, hey, this guy's not mentally stable and we don't think he should have a firearm, there isn't a lot police can do. So somehow the individual was able to get possession back of the firearm within 9 days, go into this school and do a school shooting, kill 2 people, injure 7, so 9 shot total. With this, there's a couple things. So let's talk about the police response. As much as we talked about the horrible and awful response from Uvalde during this officer-involved shooting, this is exactly how police officers should respond to officer-involved shooting. So here's what happened. Within someone calling police, police officers arrived on scene within 4 minutes. A lot of the police officers who arrived on scene were off duty. They were actually at a funeral for a retired police officer who had passed away. They left the funeral in their just regular clothes, and they all headed to the scene. So on-duty and off-duty police officers got to the scene within 4 minutes. And instead of just sitting around and waiting around outside, once they got there, they did exact the right thing and they entered the school. Now, this was a really big school. It actually had 3 floors to it. So when I say the time frame, maybe it might sound kind of like a long time till they actually reach the gunman. But if you think about it, trying to clear a school that has 3 stories to it, it's reasonable that it took this long. So from the time they got on scene to they cleared the school and actually made contact with the shooter was 8 minutes. So within 8 minutes of getting on scene, police officers were in a gunfight with the bad guy. And within 2 minutes of starting that gunfight, bad guy was dead. So the police haven't said specifically whether or not it was their bullet who killed the bad guy or if it was suicide. They just say that the police did engage in a gunfight with the individual and he was killed within 2 minutes. So again, I don't want to say that the police are responsible who did the good job in killing this guy or if he killed himself, because that information just hasn't definitely been out there. But we do know police got there quickly. Once there, they went into the school immediately. They searched out for the bad guy and they engaged in a gunfight with him within 8 minutes, which is exactly what they were supposed to do. So the response to this was absolutely fantastic from law enforcement. But again, this shooting just really hasn't been covered. So let's compare this to the Kyle Rittenhouse case. And the reason I'm going to compare it to Kyle Rittenhouse is because Kyle Rittenhouse was the exact same age, I think maybe 1 year difference, but just about the same age as this individual. So Kyle Rittenhouse shot 3 people and he killed 2 of them, just like this individual. But this person, the bad guy in this case, he shot 9 people, 3 times as many people as Kyle Rittenhouse. Yet you're not going to see this case on the news, on national news, where they talk about it every single day. You're not going to see The View talk about it and disparage the shooter constantly. And you have to ask yourself why. So I'm curious in the comments about why people might think that's the case. Is why a case like Kyle Rittenhouse case, where it's obvious self-defense, where he shot 3 people who were actively attacking him. So the victims just weren't very sympathetic victims. But in this case, people in the school, students and teachers inside of a school, absolutely sympathetic victims. So why is this case not being covered as much? I think that's an important question to ask. Okay, so yeah, so let's see. Sergeant George, first Columbine, then Sandy Hook, Robb Elementary, and now the St. Louis school shooting. Schools are suddenly turning into gigantic war zones. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. So statistically, they are still pretty rare. But we have to think about, okay, what can we do just on a policy or just on a reasonable level to stop some of these school shootings? And it just seems like, and we don't know how this individual entered the school. So it just seems like the first thing to do is just make sure all doors at a school are locked. I know that sounds simple, but that's how the Uvalde shooter got in. And I'm not sure how this shooter got in. There's been conflicting information, but just make sure all doors are locked. That seems like a pretty simple thing. And then have armed police officers at the school. Are they going to be able to stop the school shooter every single time? No. Especially on big schools. Could the police officer be in the gym and a bad guy come into a different building in the school? Yes. So an armed police officer, that's not a cure-all, but just having someone on scene, I don't see how anyone thinks that that is a bad idea. So those are some of the things that I think we might be able to do just on a reasonable, just policy level, just to try to protect schools. But again, this was a tragedy, but the police response was exactly how we want police to respond to active shooters. Someone has a question about the Daniel Santee has a question about Fabian Gonzalez sentencing in New Mexico. That's a really good question, so I'll do that really quick. So for those of you who don't know, this was a case in Albuquerque, New Mexico that happened a few years ago. The short version is that Victoria Martins was a 10-year-old girl who was killed. She was killed by Fabian Gonzalez, was an individual. He met Michelle Martins, who was Victoria's mother. They met on a dating app. Within a few weeks of knowing each other, they started to live together. Essentially, Fabian Gonzalez moved into an apartment in Albuquerque that was shared by Victoria Martins and Michelle Martins. They started doing drugs together. Then Fabian Gonzalez's horrible cousin, Jessica Kelly, who has a violent history and was always on drugs and meth, she gets out of prison. She starts to hang out over there. Well, there was one evening right around Victoria Martins' 10th birthday where Fabian Gonzalez and the mother, Michelle Martins, they went out looking for drugs. While they were out looking for drugs, tragically, Victoria Martins was killed in a pretty horrific fashion inside the apartment, and the only one there was Jessica Kelly. Once Fabian Gonzalez and the mother got back, Victoria Martins' body was set on fire. It was dismembered. It was absolutely horrible. Police officers arrested all three of those individuals, Fabian Gonzalez, the mother, and Jessica Kelly, who was there when Victoria Martins was tragically killed. So Fabian Gonzalez was just sentenced in Albuquerque yesterday. He was found guilty of essentially creating a situation that would lead for there to be a situation where there was the death of a child, endangerment of a child, and he was sentenced to 37 years yesterday. So my thoughts on that are good. That is absolutely fantastic. The judge, Cindy Leos, she made some really good comments, and she said that yes, that even though Fabian Gonzalez wasn't physically present when Victoria was killed, he helped to create a situation that made it likely that there could be violence against Victoria Martins, and I agree with the judge 100%. So that's an awful, horrible, tragic case, but it is a good legal outcome. I believe that Fabian Gonzalez got 37 years. The mother got 12 to 15 years because they needed her testimony. And then Jessica, 37 and a half for Fabian. And then I believe that Jessica Kelly got around 44 years or so. So thank you for asking about that particular case. It's a case that should be a national story because of how horrific it was. So I know that we talked about Uvalde last week, and we always kind of talk about Uvalde. Let's see. If you are a real cop, I love you as long as you ain't liberal. Well, I mean, I don't. Okay. I don't like to just criticize people just because they're, conservative or liberal. I think it's way more interesting to criticize policy because I think we can all look, both Democrats and Republicans have good policies and bad policies. And I think that's the more interesting and honest conversation is to say, let's look at this policy and see what are the likely results and then have our arguments there. But thank you, Chet. Let's see. Okay, so Uvalde. So Stephen McCraw is the chief of police, the head of the Texas Department of Public Safety. You'll remember him because he was the one who was essentially right after the Uvalde shooting. He was speaking on behalf of the government because the governor is the one, because the governor was the one who appoints the chief of the Texas Department of Public Safety. So he gave a lot of the briefings, and a lot of the information that Steve McCraw gave to the media in these initial briefings, like right after Uvalde happened, the information just ended up not being true. And at the time, I remember saying, well, okay, well, we don't know. Is he purposely saying things that aren't true, or was this just such a fucking boondoggle, just such a mess that he doesn't know and he's just trying to give the best information that he can? I think I even said at the time on a live that, if he's saying something that isn't true, there's body cameras, there's surveillance video. So if Mr. McCraw, Chief McCraw, is saying something that's not true, like, this is going to come out and it's going to be obvious that he wasn't telling the truth. So the idea that he was lying about stuff just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think especially when it comes to government officials, I think to always assume someone's lying probably isn't correct. It's more likely that they just didn't know or that it's incompetence. I think that's usually the way to go. But there was a public meeting, a Public Safety Commission hearing yesterday in Austin, Texas, that Steve McCraw gave a 15-minute speech at. After the public hearing, people, mostly family members of victims in Uvalde, were talking about it. Were able to ask him questions. And basically what they wanted was for Steve McCraw to resign, and they kept asking that he be terminated and that he resign from his position. One of the reasons is that Steve McCraw, he gave a public statement that basically said that during the investigation, during this internal investigation, that if there's any way that Texas Department of Public Safety failed the community, he said, I should go. So he basically said that he should resign and be held responsible if any member of the Texas Department of Public Safety failed the public. Well, since then, we've had some more information. We know that they fired a sergeant, the highest ranking Texas Department of Public Safety member. He was a sergeant. He was on scene. He was one of the ones who had given an order to not go in, and he was fired. Recently, there was also a commander with the Texas State Police who also was terminated for his role in the response of Uvalde. So there has been some problems there. Also, from new surveillance video and body camera footage that has just come out, we know that at one point there were 91 members of the Texas Department of Public Safety who were on scene. And some of them actually arrived and were physically there on scene within 10 minutes of when the call came in. So it's one of those things that it's one of those things that yes, there have been some calls for him to resign, and I think they're reasonable, and people are obviously pissed off. At this meeting, there were representatives, both Republicans and Democrats, who were elected representatives who were asking for Mr. McCraw to resign from his position as the Texas head of the Department of Public Safety. Now, we have to think about this as reasonably as we can, and that this is an election year. So right now, there is an election. Governor Abbott is going up against Beto O'Rourke, and it looks like Governor Abbott is going to win. But since, the governor is the one who appoints the head of the Texas Department of Public Safety, a couple weeks before the election, you absolutely, Chief McCraw is not going to resign. That politically, that just wouldn't make any sense. Now, once the election is over, because that essentially would be an admission of failure, and then Beto would be able to use that. So we have to think about all of this when it comes to politics, because that's when these things are likely going to happen. So once the election is over, Governor Abbott is likely going to be reelected. At that point, I absolutely could see Chief McCraw retiring or resigning at that point, but probably not going to happen anytime before that. Also, on my TikTok, where I post a lot of things. I've been posting a lot about this Just Stop Oil. So I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but Just Stop Oil is essentially this far left maniacal group of environmental activists. And what they do is they like to do things that, for lack of a better term, just annoy regular people. And they try to disrupt things. Why they think this is going to be convincing, I'm not sure. But here's a little bit of a recap of some of the things they've been doing. So in London, they went Van Gogh. In London, at an art gallery, there's a very famous sunflower Van Gogh painting. They took cans of tomato soup and they threw it on the Van Gogh painting. Now, the Van Gogh painting is under glass, so there's no permanent damage, but it's irritating. And then what they do is they glue themselves to the wall right underneath the painting. So they did that. Then in Germany, there was a painting by Monet that they threw mashed potatoes on. They've also been going to car dealerships, Bugatti, Ferrari, and Bentley, and they've been spray painting the outside. And these videos have been all over. And Just Stop Oil, the group that's in charge of this, that they all have shirts on that say Just Stop Oil. They're promoting this. You can follow them. It's amazing who on Twitter. I know that Elon Musk just took over Twitter, and we might talk about that in a little bit. But it's amazing in all of these. Let me get my thoughts together. All of these things are crimes. This is all criminal activity. We can all agree maybe it's low-level criminal activity, but it's still criminal actions. And it's amazing who's allowed on Twitter for saying things that who's kicked off of Twitter for just saying things that people don't like, as opposed to people committing actual crimes. Because if you follow, like I do, Just Stop Oil on Twitter, like they post all of these things. They're posting their own videos, and they haven't been kicked off the platform. Not saying that they should be kicked off the platform, but it's just amazing that, them promoting criminal activity, that's fine to be on Twitter, and people who just say things that people find offensive, those kinds of people are kicked off Twitter. So the comparison there is what a lot of people are irritated about. So also what Just Stop Oil has been doing is they've been blocking traffic and stuff like that, and that just makes it difficult for police officers and ambulances and fire trucks to get through. I just want to say that, when it comes to the environment, it's very possible that reasonable people, normal, reasonable people might have some concerns about the environment. Like that isn't an unreasonable position to just look at this and say, and just to have questions about it, or to think that it's at least somewhat important. Where I'm going with this is that there are some people who are reasonable, maybe even on the right side of the aisle, who on a policy level might actually agree, not completely because these people are nuts, but might actually agree on a little bit when it comes to a policy level with Just Stop Oil on some things. But when you do things like this, like block traffic, like spray paint random car dealerships, or throw mashed potatoes on famous paintings, when you do things like this, you disgust and just alienate people. It's almost like they said, hey, how can we make these people who might agree with us on some policy level, how can we get them to just despise us on a personal level? I know several people who are more on the left side of the aisle, and after I've posted these videos, they've reached out to me and they've said things like, I would never support a group like this or vote for a candidate that a group like this wanted me to, just because I just can't stand these tactics. So what do you think so none of this makes any sense. I just don't understand what they're doing. I'm not sure how many people, yes, Duke City Gaming, glue yourself to the Porsche showroom floor. Yes, exactly. That's the kind of stuff that they have been doing. And I don't know how many people listen to this podcast. It's the Patrick Bet David podcast, PDB podcast. It's unbelievable. I listen all the time because he asks really hard and good questions to everybody. But what Patrick Bet David had on, the two females, I don't know if I can still say that or not, but if they died and their bones were dug up 500 years from now, everyone would say that it was a female. That if Patrick Bet David had two of these women on, they were 20 years old, and he asked them some hard questions, and it's pretty sad. It's obvious that they're just being used by this company, this group, Just Stop Oil, and that they really don't know what they're talking about. So again, I just think it's an interesting issue. It's been happening everywhere. Most of it has been happening in Europe, but I'm sure it's going to come over here, and I think that we all find it just absolutely disgusting when people, especially block traffic, that's the most irritating thing. Let's see. Sergeant George says show-offs, that's all they are. Yeah, exactly. Because what they're doing really isn't making anything better. If you're concerned about the environment, why not pick up trash? Why not pick up litter? Why not go clean up a beach? Like, these are some reasonable things. If you're concerned about the environment and you say, I'm going to spend all Saturday morning and I'm going to go clean up garbage in a park, that's reasonable. We would all say, great, thank you for doing that, And then maybe they might get some support, but I guess that just isn't as much fun as throwing mashed potatoes on a Monet. Let's see. While they ride bikes, let's see. Yeah, and they ride bikes that were made by gas and oil. And I'm just gonna tell a personal story here, real quick, on this. So, I have a family friend who I've been friends with since I was a little kid. Again, it's a family friend, and about 15 years ago, she got married, and it was a green wedding. Okay, so someone comment and tell me if I'm thinking about this wrong, but it was a green wedding. It was in the Chicagoland area. That's where everyone was from, and the wedding was at a state park about 2 hours from Chicago. So everyone, 150, 200 people, essentially had to drive from Chicago to this state park 2 hours away for a green wedding. And they made such a big deal about how it was a green wedding and reused flowers. I made that up. I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention. But, it was all vegetarian food. And this is a whole big deal about how it was a green wedding. But again, literally 200 people had to drive 2 hours each way in order to get there. And it just seems like the gas emissions to get to this green wedding were just pretty silly. As opposed to what they were trying to accomplish. So I just thought that was always a contradiction there, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone could put it in the chat. Another interesting case that we covered a couple times was the Darrell Brooks case, the mass murderer in Waukesha, Wisconsin. So his circus trial finally came to an end. So he was charged. He drove his red SUV through a Christmas parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin last year. He killed 6 people, injured 62. He represented himself in court. The whole thing has been an absolute mess. I've talked about it the last couple weeks just because it is just such a circus. He gets in shouting matches with judges, and then he has to be put into a different room. He's a sovereign citizen. I mean, this thing has just everything. If they did a movie about Dahmer, they should really do a movie about this guy too, because it's absolutely crazy. But he was convicted of over 70 charges. So I think it was 76. He's also a rap star. They played some of his rap videos in the trial. It was absolutely it's wild stuff. So he was convicted of, I think, 76 charges and found guilty on just about everything. You could find some of his, it's really interesting what Spotify has decided to do with this. They essentially got rid of Kanye and they're putting all of Darrell Brooks stuff in there instead. So that's interesting. But he was found guilty of the 70 charges. As he was being sentenced, one of the victim's family members yelled out in court, "Rotten hell, you piece of shit," which is, I think, a lot of what people were thinking someone did. An individual got kicked out of court, of course, because the judge has to, maintain courtroom rules and stuff like that. But I think that's absolutely appropriate. And this should, once and for all, I went over what sovereign citizens are last week, so I'm not going to do that again. But this should, once and for all, just be a case study of how the sovereign citizen defense, first of all, how stupid it is and how it doesn't work. It's not a real thing. It's ridiculous. It's like Scientology. Like, it's not real, okay? So anytime any police officers on here or anyone, has the unfortunate instance of meeting a sovereign citizen, just play them some of this Darrell Brooks tape and you'll be able to see that, hey, this stuff actually does not work in a real court of law. Maybe in an imaginary court of law in some kind of a fantasy, but in the real world, the sovereign citizen defense absolutely does not work. So his sentencing, I believe on Monday of next week, they're going to have another court setting. And at that point, I don't think he's going to be sentenced on that date, but they're going to say when the sentencing is, and the judge should set a date. What this just reminds me of, how many people watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but Charlie fancies himself to be the greatest bird lawyer in the United States. And listening to some of Darrell Brooks' arguments reminds me of Charlie from It's Always Sunny. So my favorite episodes of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia are the episodes where they're in court and they have trials. I think it's absolutely great. Sometimes I have my kids, who one's 13, one's 7. Sometimes in order to settle a dispute, I'll have a mock trial, not like I learned in law school, but really with the same rules that they employ in Always Sunny in Philadelphia, because I think that's reasonable. Let's see if anybody has comments about some of this stuff. Okay, we'll see. Hey, Jeff Menifee. Tearing up a city is not the way to express things. When Breonna Taylor incident happens in Louisville, almost all of downtown was destroyed and looted. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure what the comment was in reference to, but I've said this before. If a police officer commits a crime, which wasn't the case in the Breonna Taylor shooting, at least when it comes to the use of force. But when a police officer does something wrong or commits a crime, it seems like the public should want that police officer to be held accountable. To me, it seems strange to go to random buildings downtown that are owned by like local grocery stores and to burn down a local grocery store because you're mad about something that a police officer did. To me, that doesn't make any sense. If someone can explain that logic to me, if someone can explain that logic to me, I'd love to hear it. Sergeant George says, I've never had any time to watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Well, sir, you should make time. It is an unbelievable show. It is extremely funny. So now we go on to New York City, and I've covered this a couple times before, but in this past week, New York City had something happen again. Another random person was pushed onto the subway tracks. And I say random, so it's not like this was like a domestic violence situation or there was a dispute over business that went bad or people were arguing. Like I always imagine Seinfeld, where Kramer's trying to get into the subway car and he's getting into fights with people. It wasn't anything like that. Like literally a person just standing there and a random offender running up to him and pushing him in. So this happened again this past week. Luckily, this individual survived. But in New York City, this is the 25th time that this has happened this year. 2 of them have actually been fatal. This individual that they found, he was in custody. The police were able to arrest him based on the surveillance video. They do have him in custody. Obviously, he's been arrested 200 times. He's just a career criminal who we can all objectively, not even looking at what he looks like or anything like that, just read the list of crimes he's been charged with and convicted of and say, yeah, this person should not be in society with everybody else. That's this guy. So luckily, he didn't kill this individual, but it's a scary thing to be pushed in front of a subway car. And that leads me to just a couple things. So I talked about public policy earlier and how public policy, especially when it comes to criminal justice and crime, just has very predictable results. So one of the things that New York City did is they implemented broken windows back in the 90s. Now, broken windows was a crime control theory that was created by someone named James Q. Wilson in 1982. And just the base level what it is that minor signs of social decay, like broken windows, minor signs of social decay and disorder can contribute to an atmosphere where crime is allowed and happens. That's basically what it is. Another way to phrase it is if you enforce and take care of the small things, the big things will take care of themselves. And the best way that I can describe this, and the best example, is New York City under Rudy Giuliani, before he was working for Trump and had the hair dye running down his face and he was silly. When Rudy Giuliani was a very serious person as the mayor of New York, he hired a really smart guy, Bill Bratton, as the chief of police. And between 1990 and 1996, they ran this broken windows type crime. And they went after what they call quality of life crime. So especially in the subway system, people who were jumping turnstiles, so just not paying to get in and just jumping through. Drinking in public, urinating in public, disorderly conduct. So all of these that I guess we would consider smaller crimes, quality of life crimes, the enforcement on that was ramped up. If they saw you doing it, it was like everybody gets arrested. There are no second chances. We catch you jumping a turnstile, you're going to jail. Now that might sound harsh, but what they found, basically the data through 7 years of doing this, what they found is that it's really difficult for police officers to catch someone right before or prevent right before someone pushes someone into a subway tracks, or before someone is robbed at gunpoint, or before there's a violent assault. It's really difficult because if people see police officers, they're not going to do those kinds of things right in front of them. So it's really difficult for police officers to catch people committing these violent felonies. But what they found is that, it really isn't that important to catch people doing the violent felonies as long as we get those people into custody for something. And they found that the same people, shockingly, the same people who were committing the violent offenses were the exact same group of people who were committing these minor offenses. So anytime someone jumped a turnstile and the police caught them, immediately they were arrested and went to jail. These are called quality of life issues and crimes that were enforced to an unbelievable degree. So the case that I talked about this past week that happened in New York City, so one of the ways the individual, and I'm not saying that this would have absolutely prevented it, but right before the individual pushed the guy onto the tracks, he jumped the turnstile in order to get in. So that's pretty much just an example of that. We talk about these are the policies that that were put in place. Well, what were the results? Well, from 1990 to 1996, when broken windows was implemented, and Chief Bill Bratton was in New York City implementing this crime control, really heavy crackdown on small, minor, quality of life crimes, violent crimes and felonies went down 40%, and the murder rate was cut in half. Here's what I mean by that. In the year 1990, there were just over 2,600 murders in New York City. By 1996, when Bill Bratton retired, there were just over 1,300 murders. Literally, the murder rate was cut in half. Now, the correlation isn't always causation. So I'm not saying it was just broken windows, but really it's a set of multiple different policies. The main one, the base level theory and philosophy being broken windows of why this occurred. So, I've talked before about Black Lives Matter, and I think Black lives do matter. Every life matters. We should want to save as many people as possible. So if we look at the numbers in New York City on a yearly basis, who are the murder victims? So who's actually being killed in New York City? And even though African Americans only make up about 15% of the population in New York City, they represent 67% of people who are the victims of homicide in New York City. So if we take the number from 1990 to 1996, 1,300 people, 1,300 lives every year were saved. Well, 67% of that is 838. So essentially, this broken windows policy, every year that it was implemented, it saved over 800 Black lives. And it just seems like if we really care about saving people, this is the kind of thing that we should be doing and the kind of policies that we should be implementing. Because in every city, in every population, there are predators and there are criminals. We need to take those criminals out of society, throw them in jail, so the other 99% of us can just live normal lives. And we can go into Walgreens and we can go to the subway without having to worry about being pushed in or being robbed in the subway. Let's see, Duke City Gaming, where is all the money they made? Black Lives Matter is being investigated by all kinds of attorney generals, and there's going to be some criminal charges coming down, absolutely. Let's see. They've also made some. They've also bought several different multi-million-dollar mansions. Those are the main cases that I want to talk about. Let's see. Any other comments? Any other comments here? Let's see. No other comments. So those were the cases that I. Let's see. Talk about the lieutenant being reinstated after. Okay. So don't have any other comments or any other questions. Let's see. Nope, nothing else. So, those are the cases that I want to go over. It was a really interesting week for crime. Like I said, the main story was that Paul Pelosi story. So, we'll definitely track that one as it goes on. And, that's going to just about wrap it up for today. So, please make sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe to Cops and Cons TV. Also, if you want to go ahead and follow me on Police Law News, I also started writing on Substack at Police Law Newsletter, if you want to go ahead and subscribe there. But I hope everyone has a great and safe weekend. Thanks very much.